Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter, and with me today, once again, is Dr. John Shook. Dr. Shook, how are you?
I'm doing real well.
That's good. I thank you for once again. So we've been struggling with we did a show yesterday on Christopher Columbus, who's been a pet peeve of mine for a very long time. I'm most displeased with the man, and unfortunately, we had catastrophic hardware failure and getting the sound up and running. The sound on that show was unfortunately not particularly good. We're getting there, but you've been very patient with us, so I sincerely appreciate it. It doesn't help that one of our mods, as we were going, oh, the sound's too loud. I was like, oh, God, I got to reset that, and I turned that. Thanks. Thank you. Who was that? Yeah, was that Titan or was that Tony? I'll blame Tony. I blame him for everything. Anyways, thank you all for joining us. So, John, last time you were here, we discussed generations theory, which I will tell you I've been thinking a lot about since then. And I'm my generation, Generation X. I've always sort of thought that the values that I have are the only real values. And then you were talking about some of the values of other generations, and I've realized it made sense to me in a way that I hadn't before. So before we get into this, could you quickly explain what is generations theory, and explain what are the generations that we're looking at, and what does it say about any upcoming large events that we might be able to expect?
Sure. In brief, generations theory is a specific theory in a new academic field. It's called Cleodynamics. Cleo, from the Greek god of history,
Oh.
CLIO, dynamics. And that was named by an academic by the name of Peter Turchin, who I recommend enthusiastically. We could have another show, maybe reach out to Peter. So he deserves the credit for the overarching subfield of history becoming scientific. That is to say, there are dynamic patterns in historical time, but of course, the present is not some special line dividing the past and the future from a scientific standpoint. It just happens to be where you and I are, but that's just subjective. Objectively, there are real patterns in social and civic and political history. So predicting the future becomes within the realm of a scientific lens. Generations theory is a way to try to predict large civilizations. So you have to have nations that have lasted for hundreds of years, and there are patterns. The book Generations, published in 1991, and Strauss, specifically describes the historical patterns of one civilization, the Anglo-American civilization, and then takes a glimpse into the future based upon these patterns. In 1991, they predicted the rise of the baby boomers, political agendas surrounding puritanical righteousness, black and white thinking, and civic decay into what they predicted would be either a civil war here on American turf or possibly World War III or some combination. And I suppose that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Lost your sound.
Sorry, my dog was barking, and I had up so that I wouldn't. I had muted myself, so I wouldn't. And that's also why they call me on top of the $400 Soutter, the muter Soutter. At any rate, um, you can hear me now, I assume. Yeah, you're smiling, so you you can hear
I can
me.
hear you now.
um, a lot of people say, well, gee, it's how can you predict the future? And people also say, isn't the process of predicting the future going to affect it somehow? And I would assume there's at least a little truth to the second one, if and when this theory really gets absorbed into the public consciousness. But would it be fair to maybe suggest that the predictions that we're talking about are almost akin to climate change, where we can't predict the weather, we can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow, we can't predict what's going to happen next week. Well, we can make some predictions about tomorrow, but we can't make predictions about any specific day in the future. But we can predict trends. Is that maybe fair?
No, we can predict the future with astonishing accuracy. Economics can do it better than weather forecasting. This skepticism about knowing general patterns, habits, and laws of the future is just because theory hasn't been refined, scientifically, rigorously tested. History is one of the uh, most recent disciplines to undergo this gradual uh, scientification, becoming more like science. But there's no point to skepticism because it's premature. You could have said the same thing to Isaac Newton about physics during his lifetime, and he ignored the skeptics and proceeded to announce laws of physics and subjected them to empirical and experimental scrutiny. So the skepticism is beside the point. It's the result of ignorance. What we have to do is let academic disciplines proceed on with their empirical methods and see where they get us.
All right. So now there is a prediction that based on past cycles of events and of these generations that we are
Many
going to.
predictions.
Yeah, there is a lot of predictions. The one I'm interested in particular, for today's topic, is a prediction. As you had said, they predicted the boomers, and they made some interesting predictions about the millennials, which is interesting because as we've talked about, I was like, I know a few people, but I did want to get into one about upheavals, great upheavals, usually wars of some kind, that suggests that we would be looking at either, I think, some kind of a civil war or a even World War III.
At the four previous ones, three of them were on American soil, and two of them, the American Revolution, Civil War, were civil war. So 30 years ahead, back in 1991, they couldn't tell us whether it was going to only be a civil war or a civil war combined with some external war. World War II, if World War II hadn't have happened, we may well have been plunged into a civil war here on American soil because the aftermath of the Great Depression is not working well for Roosevelt in his second term. And American fabric of society was fraying very badly. So we may have had some sort of clash of class warfare would have been over unemployment, and the country could have kind of come apart. In a way, World War II saved us from a civil war. World War III may save us again from a civil war, but there's certainly no argument now that America is not already in a civil war now. So that big prediction has effectively come true 30 years later.
I I do think now one of the things that I've heard about this is the predictions that essentially we enter after we have an upheaval of some kind. We enter a time of stability. People are much more focused on strengthening our institutions and sort of trying to make sure that whatever it was that happened never happens again. Then people there's you end up with these different generations, and you eventually come back to a generation that seems to challenge and upend all of those institutions. Now, arguably, I've frankly, every president for the last 5 or 6 years, not everyone, I think certainly a number that haven't, but actually, well, no, maybe every generation does think that of the presidents that they see. But certainly, I heard it said with Trump, like, oh my God, not Trump, sorry, Bush, oh my God, he's upending everything, he's changing every, but he didn't, he was very centrist compared to any number of other presidents that we've had. But you take a look at Trump, and here is a man who is undermining, at least in my view, all of our major institutions. He's been undermining the uh, our intelligence agencies. He's been undermining our history in many respects. He's been undermining. So is Trump a not him specifically, but a president that would behave this way, something that would have fallen into this prediction? And if so, what makes this kind of thing happen?
Uh, Trump is symptomatic of his generation. The generation's theory is not about specific presidencies. This would have all happened if Hillary Clinton had won, perhaps even faster. Not because Hillary Clinton's planning on being an autocrat, but just because the nation's social and civic fabric was fraying beyond repair anyway. That had been going on for the previous 20 years, and everybody knew it. So there's no point in selecting particular presidencies. According to generations theory, at the most, the generation that is in elderhood, in greatest political power, is going to affect how the crisis uh, has its onset and proceeds, but it can't delay it. Can't delay it. It was going to be inevitable.
So, and then this fraying was ostensibly responsible for World War II. We were going to have some kind of upheaval. The upheaval ended up being a world war instead of a civil war, and so we're now in roughly the same situation. Is that the case? If I'm understanding
Well, it's
correctly?
it's interesting. There are reasons why everybody is drawing comparisons back to the 1930s, not just because of the damaging financial instabilities, the enormous disparity between the rich and poor, which is typical at this stage of the pattern, but also America became a big enough country that it sort of creates its own weather. In other words, you could say that the 1930s, on the road to World War II, of course, was a European phenomenon. What could this have possibly do with events in America? Well, America went along with France's extraordinarily punitive reparations against Germany in the aftermath of World War I. Wilson went along with it. The League of Nations was never embraced in America, which went into an isolationist phase. So, in many respects, Europe's descent into World War II can be placed at the fault of America's failure of European policy and international leadership. Oh, wait, are we talking about the 2000s and 2010s? Of course, America went into an isolationist mood, abandoned allies. Trump is simply accelerating that. But we have seen America withdraw from a world stage, and correspondingly, we've seen America's adversaries accelerate their own plans for the global chessboard. So America is responsible for creating much of the conditions that are now setting the stage for a World War III. But there doesn't have to be a World War III in order for theory to be vindicated. As I said, and vindicated.
All right. Oh, lost audio there for a second.
Because we are descending into a homeland civil war.
All right. So now I had actually, this may be a little off topic, but I had I had read a New York Times piece that said that actually they were discussing with a former um, expert on revolutions in the FBI, and he said, yeah, we've actually already started a civil war here in the United States. Is that something you feel competent to expand on any? Because you had suggested that as well, that we're already sort of starting a civil war here. What does that look like to you?
Not hearing anything.
All
Everything
right.
frozen.
Um, hmm, uh, okay, so you're. Let me try to restart your camera there. Give me 1 second. All right. Is that better? No, that I don't think that's. No, no, you've got no. Okay, I have. Um, let me try.
Okay, now I'm getting sound from you.
Oh, okay. All right. I honestly, I sincerely apologize. I have no idea what the issue is, but um, it's been said. I've heard it said several times that we've actually already started a civil war. This is slightly off topic, but um, does that you seem to echo that sentiment? Does that look like what's happening to you now, and what do you think that looks like going forward? No. Okay. Hmm. I have no. Let me try. Now, I assume you can always call a tech expert. Yeah, I suppose that's true. Um, well, what I may need to do is call him back. I don't know. There seems to be some interruption in the sound. I This reports that his sound is set up properly. So what we may do is just um, I'm going to call you back. Call you back. Hopefully he could see that, and I can hear his sound just fine. So let me. I'm going to hang up on him.
You're coming through very scrambled, like every third word.
All right, I'm going to call you back. Hold on 1 second. Let's reboot the call. And all right, how is that? Is that any better?
Check, check. Sound?
All right, I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me? Looks like
Every third word.
every third word still. All right. Oh, yep. It looks like I do see that for some reason the sound is the NDI output is not.
I hear you a little better now.
All right. I'll try to speak up a bit louder. I apologize. I can hear you just fine. So,
Okay.
what evidence, what does, you said it appears that we are in the throes of starting a civil war. What does that look like going forward to you?
Well, it's not just us. The entire planet now. Many countries are being frayed by on-the-ground civic distress and strife. Um, let me read to you a little bit of lineup. It's not going to sound only familiar just of America nowadays in our headlines. It's going to sound familiar about lots of countries around the world, and this is not a coincidence because generations theory can explain what's going on in many countries. Uh, I'm going to quote a little bit from a 1997 book, the last book together, called The Fourth Turning. The fourth turning refers to this stage of the cycle as the civic crisis foments and erupts upon us. This is what they foretold. 1997, okay? This is before the internet became huge. This is 9 years before Facebook. This is what they described for the early 2020s. First of all, economic distress, public debt in default, trust funds in bankruptcy, mounting poverty, mounting unemployment, trade wars, collapsing financial markets, hyperinflation or deflation. Sound familiar? Not in 1997. People reading that in 1997 would have said, where is this happening? There's no evidence of this. They're talking about 25 years into the future. The next thing they talk about is what's called social distress, violence fueled by class and wealth, race, violence fueled by nativism. Boy, have we seen a lot of that. Nationalism out of control. Also caused by religion, abetted by armed gangs, underground militias, mercenaries hired by walled communities. Inconceivable in 1997, nowhere to be found in 1997. Well, they weren't talking about 1997. They were talking about 2020 and the early 2020s. Those underground militias, they're not so underground. They're walking around above ground, aren't they? Cultural distress. With categories, for example, they talk about how the media is going to be plunging into a dizzying decay. This is before social media, and they're already predicting all media plunging into dizzying decay. They also talk about, quote, a decency backlash in favor of state censorship. That's coming true as the national governments around the world are increasingly putting pressure on social media to censor hate and other anti-civic organizations. Technological distress. They cite crypto anarchy, high-tech oligarchy, biogenetic chaos. Yes, we're seeing that in the environment, for example, as well. And that leads into ecological distress. Their quote, atmospheric damage, energy shortage, water shortages, new diseases. 1997, they're quoting this. Not just about America, but about the entire world, and too. Couple more categories, political and military distress. Here's what they say about the politics peering 25 years into the future. Institutional collapse, open tax revolt, one-party hegemony, major constitutional change, secessionism in America, right? States threatening to leave the Union, authoritarianism, changing national borders. Well, that hasn't happened in America yet, but it is changing around the world. Under the category of military distress, wars against terrorism, foreign regimes equipped with weapons of mass destruction. We're seeing nuclear proliferation as we speak. Now, you might say any one of those things you could predict for 25 years in the future and be guaranteed being right, right? But they're saying all of those things will be happening simultaneously 25 years into their future. That's now. No one was predicting that. So what we see here with generations theory is cliodynamics becoming scientific. It's not just enough to make vague predictions. You have to make many specific predictions, what's called in philosophy of science, risky predictions. Could they be proven false by future events? Generations theory makes hundreds of specific risky predictions. They made them in their 1991 book, in the rest of their books in the 90s. All of them are coming pretty much true within the limits of empirical accuracy. And the big ones now are coming true as well. The biggest ones, World War.
So we had talked, and I'd spoken with you about this, and I thought you brought an interesting point. I had spoken with a few people in the military who had suggested that, this was a while ago, that China was a very big concern because they were building up their navy in order to transport ships, or sorry, to transport equipment to other countries, which they would have to do to actually launch an offensive military campaign. But you had suggested that if World War III comes, it wouldn't be from China. So first of all, we had a question here: is it going to get worse before it gets better? And that's the first question. And the second is, if we have World War III, where is it going to come from, and what's it going to look like?
Well, strictly speaking, in 1991, generations theory, 30 years out, did not mention specific countries. How could it? That's not the generations theory job. It's only with the spectacles of near sight, we're almost on top of this, can we start talking about specific regions and specific countries. So sometimes I'll answer in terms of the 1991 generations theory, and at other times, anybody could, if they're following the headlines, predict World War III for themselves. I have no special expertise in that area. I'm not a military expert. I'm not a political expert. I'm not an international relations expert. But I have been following this for 30 years. And what you need to do is you need to look at the countries that have the most to lose. Those are going to be the countries that are going to be willing to resort to violent aggression. In the previous show, I suggested that if there is a World War III, it won't be started with a war by China. It could end with a war by China, but that's a different matter. I'm much more concerned with Russia and the former Soviet Union territories, and of course, intersecting with the Middle East. But I'm just a philosopher. You shouldn't listen to me. You should read the headlines. But
Yep.
the interesting thing about the headlines is the headlines are confirming all of the worst dire predictions made back in 1991. And the reason is interesting. You have up on the slideshow the Anglo-American experience. Flip ahead. Let's go through the next couple of slides, and we'll take a look at why the world stage is now set. Here's how Strauss talking about the crisis of 2020. Again, they couldn't predict 30 years out if it would be only a homeland civil war or it would be an external war or some sort of combination. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, that's the peer groups. Maybe we'll come back to that. Flip ahead a little bit more. We'll talk about.
Is this one good, or let's see, we got this one. We've got a
Oh,
couple
I want
more.
to get to the lineup of world leaders. That's a later, almost the end. I think you pulled up the old PDF.
I may have.
Yeah, this isn't today's PDF.
Oh, all right.
Sorry.
No worries. Let me see if I can get the correct one. Give me a second.
Well, I'll do a little bit of talking while you pull up the PDF. With generations theory, it's valid for any large nation or civilization that's been in control of its own affairs for at least 100 years, 200 years, 300 years. That means like it doesn't really apply to small countries or small regions, but it's going to apply to big civilizations, big countries. And most everybody's generational clock was reset with World War II. In some parts of the world, it wasn't World War II, it was intense, destructive regional conflicts or civil wars. But if you look at world history, most of the world's large countries either were participants in World War II, they were participants in peripheral regional theaters of conflict that had something to do with the instabilities of World War II, or they had descended into their own homeland political chaos and civil war. Countries from Japan all the way to Argentina and most everywhere in between. Generations theory predicts that this major civic conflict is going to, in effect, set the generational clock, which means that now most of the planet is on the same heartbeat.
So now this clock resets. Is it, if I recall, is it every 4 generations roughly? Is that the?
Right, somewhere around 85 to 95 years, and we're entering into the low 80s. So we can see this, at least the Civil War begin to unfold.
All right, and I should have here for you. There you go. This is,
I
I
should have
believe.
given it a different title so you could tell the difference.
But yeah, it's not like you didn't send it to me this morning, but okay. Um, all right, so here we go, and I think this has the leaders. I think this is
The
the one.
first five are the same, and then I added some stuff because we're only going to talk about. Oh yeah, the generation clock. Let's look at this.
All right.
The last major crisis area. We've got Japan, Korea, China, Philippines, India, Pakistan, Russia, Iran, Turkey. I mean, you're hearing regional powers, superpowers, nuclear powers, right? Eastern Europe, Western Europe, North Africa, Brazil, Argentina, and so on. So they all now are on the Anglo American clock. This has profound ramifications. This has never happened before. What that means is that every major power around the world is now on the same crisis clock. It's not a coincidence. Generations theory can predict this and did.
All right. So now, then, did you want to go to leaders, which I think was the next one, national leadership?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's the last.
all right.
Look at the national leadership. They're all what are called part of a prophet generation. Our prophet generation is the baby boomers, and they behave like prophets. They think like they all have perfect righteousness on their side. They all see things in terms of black and white commercials that try to sell Cadillacs to baby boomers. They're all black and white commercials. Their political leadership style tends to, again, be self righteous, tends towards authoritarianism. They like to stay in power, and they may do anything to accomplish staying in power. Right? So that slide with national leadership just picks out a few of the major players on the world stage. Putin's on that list, of course. Donald Trump down at the bottom, uh, but Angela Merkel, um, uh, you know, and yeah, they're all plus or minus 5 years of the same age.
All right.
Talk about 10-year span.
So we've got
About 70 plus or minus 5 years. Now, what does this mean? Every time that America has had this sort of prophet generation rising in political power and elderhood, America has gone through a secular crisis, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II. And now we're looking at an international chessboard where we're not the only country that has a prophet generation at the steering wheel. Our adversaries do. Many of our potent allies, regional players do. Here's an interesting thing about the prophet generation. They all believe in absolute righteousness. And they
yeah.
all believe not only that they deserve to win, but they shall
Mm.
win at any cost. This is a generation of leadership style that will not hesitate to go to any extreme to achieve its political goals of victory, whatever it conceives of as victory.
Mm. Okay, so well, and what I find interesting is, just as a side note, we seem to be losing allies reasonably quickly, which I would imagine would also might also have been predicted in this instability, or
Well, partially again, America is responsible. We are creating our own global weather, not just environmentally, but politically. Former reliable allies like the Philippines and Turkey, they're not reliable allies anymore. And we have abandoned international treaties, international relations. We've gone isolationist, and the rest of the world, not surprisingly, has noticed.
So if you can, like I said, there was the question I wanted to get back to, is this going to get worse before it gets better? It sounds to me like the
Well,
answer
of
to that
course,
is probably yes. Yeah, okay.
of
Well,
course,
welcome to In Time, the
we're
rosy,
about to
cheery.
go
Yeah.
through another national crisis. It's going to be expensive economically, and it's going to be tragic in terms of deaths. COVID
So,
is just a warm up, which, by the way, generations theory predicted. They
not
mentioned pandemic as helping to foment fourth turning civic upheavals and deaths.
so. Where do you think this is going, if you can predict that? A more instability. Do you think is there going to be calls from states to either secede, or uh, would a
Well,
third world war be mostly
during the
cyber?
1990s, you could sort of game play out the Civil War scenario. It would have to be a geographical division that's been accomplished. The two coasts and the major cities are on the liberal side. The heartland, the middle of America, is more conservative. Inconceivable on the political map when George Bush was president and Bill Clinton was running for office. That wasn't the map. It's the map now. So we got a geographical divide. So the culture wars is now being played out with an emphasis on the war and not the culture. One thing I predicted in the 1990s personally was that it was going to be abortion that finally did it. And that may play out in the 1990s with the Supreme Court becoming more and more conservative. If Roe v. Wade is overturned or at least allowed to go to states, we could well imagine certain states declaring themselves unanswerable to the federal government and the Supreme Court. So states may be looking at their own options, dividing over the abortion issue, egged on by furious female voters. Another easy scenario to predict is that we're looking again at the aftermath of the American Civil War, racism and white Christian nationalism on a collision course. So the country could be divided on American streets over that. Oh, wait, those are the headlines we've been looking at all year. The Civil War is already here. So now we have to watch how it specifically plays out. During the 2020s, we could foresee a scenario in which the two coasts of America decide to go their own way, leaving the heartland to its own destiny. It would be a very messy division.
So, how long would an upheaval like that last, do you think, and what, if anything, would turn it around? Well, obviously, something would turn it around at some
Well,
point.
again, if history is a guide, and I'm saying it is, generations theory is it is, the shortest conflict is on the order of 4 to 6 years, the longest on the order of around 10 to 12 years. So by 2030, America will be assessing the aftermath.
By when? I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
2030,
20.
America will be assessing the aftermath. It could be sooner,
Yes, yeah,
but
that's on the
20,
outside. That's yeah.
2030 would be.
So, and then what happens after that? Is it
Well,
do
that depends on how things turn out. What if the Confederacy had successfully seceded from the Union?
that's a fair
Could have happened.
question. Yeah, well, no, it could have. I think, I mean, in terms of now, would generations theory say that there's going to be like a rebuilding, or uh, uh, a
It
time of
depends on how things turn out.
uh,
The,
ah.
the, the last four secular crises have turned out relatively well for America. Um, so there's two scenarios, both of which are compatible with generations theory. One is where we go. 5 for 5. America overcomes its internal divisions and succeeds in winning whatever amounts to World War III. And then we go into post-war era of refocus on rebuilding, reinvestment. America will come together the way it did in the 1950s under a series of presidents that unified this country. That would be a positive outcome.
What would a negative
Negative
outcome?
outcomes are not as
Yeah.
pleasant to try to forecast.
Okay, okay. I'll stay out of that. Um, all right. So, uh, well, I think I do appreciate. I know we've been running late, and I don't want to keep you too long. I do think there's a couple of shows we could easily have you back for, and philosophy is one of the ones that we often have just segments, entire segments. We have a series on philosophy, so I would like to get you back. Was there anything in particular about this forecasting that you wanted to make sure we covered before we wrapped up?
Beware of your elders. You and I are Generation X. Generation X and the Xer generations in other countries around the world are going to have a front row seat to whatever this apocalyptic prophet generation globally has in store for us. In this 1991 book, the authors point out that it may be some Xer general or politician that stays the prophet's apocalyptic hands and prevents that elderly hand from loosing the fateful lightning of atomic war on this planet. This generation of prophets has now the means to turn the world's lights out, and we're not alone. If World War III erupts, we will be facing determined opposition, and it will be very difficult to predict the outcome because all of these countries will be willing, their prophet-like generations will be willing to go to any means necessary to accomplish their righteous goal. The planet has not seen this situation before. That's why I think that this one will be a very interesting scenario to watch play out during the 2020s.
Your philosopher credentials are absolutely bona fide. Only a philosopher would take a look at that and say, it's going to be interesting. Yeah, yeah, that's one way to put it. All right. Well, Dr. Shook, thank you very much. And once again, I sincerely apologize for the late start. As we like to say, we are in time, not on time. Next week, are
It's
not.
been wonderful being on again. I can't thank you enough, Nick.
Oh, thank you, sir. We are going to be doing. We're going to be discussing raising secular children. If you're an atheist, if you're secular, raising children in a increasingly secular society, but still one that treats. I think you'd find a Muslim being elected president easier than you would an atheist. And then next week we are going to. I'll wait on that. And then we're going to be, of course, covering the election live starting at 6 o'clock. We're going to have a whole bunch of guests. But until then, once again, thank you, Dr. Shook, very much for coming along. And thank you all for joining us. And we look for, oh, yeah, I will be in the Discord. We'll do an after show. I'll be in the Discord and we can all catch up afterwards. Anybody who wants to join me there. So I'll be there in about 5 minutes. Thank you all for coming. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon.